Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, or the philosophy show, as is now the new channel where Amos and we upload videos of our philosophical conversations. Today we're back with Amos and myself with a new topic to discuss, or multiple topics related to each other. We're thinking of starting off by discussing the idea of ends justifying the means. In other words, the idea that there might be these goals or goods that we want to achieve. However, we have to use some morally questionable means to achieve them. So then the question is the usage of those means justified because we have a good end in mind? Does the end justify the means? And then we'll perhaps dive into specific manifestations of this idea. So Amos, I suppose we could start off by discussing the basic ideas in this concept of the ends justifying the means. Perhaps you want to define what an end is and what a means is, or perhaps just talk about their moral value, or yeah, you could go ahead and see where you want to start.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's a good idea to start with the definition as always, because then it's clear what we are talking about. So yeah, I was thinking you could define an end in the sense of a goal that you are trying to reach. You could define this more narrowly or more broadly, and I'm not sure which definition we should choose. Perhaps we can discuss that, because you could say an end or a goal is just a material state of affairs or of the world around me, or just of some very specific instance. For example, if I'm hungry, then the end or the goal could be to no longer be hungry. And then in that sense, it would be very narrowly and materially defined, kind of a material state of reality. And then if you would define the means also as the material kind of things that you can use in order to reach this material end, then for example, I could go and steal food and eat it, and then I would no longer be hungry. And then we would be kind of, I think, in this general setting in which this question is most often understood. But if we were to define ends or goals also very broadly, like living in a good or moral society where values are upheld, then it would become kind of a different discussion, and it would become more complicated, or at least the conclusion might be different. So I'm not quite sure how broad we should define ends and means in this conversation. So yeah, perhaps what do you think of this?
I would say that we can talk about ends and means being more or less extensive. Perhaps you could say that, or comprehensive, or at least extensive. You can have ends that are relatively small and ends that are relatively large. And I would say that all human action as such involve ends and means. Whenever we choose to do something, whenever we act for an end. We have an end in mind, and then we use means to at least attempt to achieve that end. So whenever you're walking towards something, there is some location, which is your end, and you use your legs as means to achieve that end, which is to reach this or that location. Or you can have ends in a more general sense, like pleasure or power or fame or economic success or money or love, having a relationship. You can do a lot of different things in order to reach those ends. And you use many different kinds of means. You use your body to move it. You can use other people as means, in a sense that if you need other people to cooperate with you in acquiring or achieving an end, them cooperating with you and you making it be the case that they cooperate with you, you will in that sense use them as means. Now, you could still say that you will sort of respect their personhood and their value as human being and still use them as means. So when we say using them as means, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are not viewing them as valuable human beings, but simply as things you can exploit. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to view it that way, but at least use them in a general sense to acquire an end. So it is a general human phenomenon, I would say. And the end, if we could sort of philosophically define ends and means, the end would be some perceived good. Perhaps you could say it is a consequence or a condition or an effect, but even more general than that, it is a perceived good, something you perceive to be a good that you want to have. And means are things that you can use in your quest for that good or perceived good. So those are my initial thoughts. What do you think about that?
Yes. Yes, I think these are very good thoughts, and it makes it more clear, because in that sense, everything can be a means or an end, and many things can even be a means and an end kind of simultaneously, perhaps in a different aspect or in a different question. And so I think what it would come down to is then that you would kind of have to define a hierarchy of goals or of priorities or of perceived goods. And you would then be in the kind of, or the rational way of behaving is then that you use or give up things of lesser priority to attain things or goals of higher priority. So, and these things which you give up, which have a lesser priority, would then be a means that you use towards achieving this end, which has a higher priority. Would you agree to that?
If I understand you correctly, you would say that we have a hierarchy of different perceived goods, and whenever we have to choose between those perceived goods, we choose one and we let go of some other, and that other good which we are letting go of, that automatically becomes a means to achieving that first good?
Yes.
Okay, well, I would say that those goods we let go of, I'm not sure if I would say that they are necessarily then means, but that they can be, depending on whether you letting go of them means that it is used in the process of achieving some end. For instance, let's say that you want to buy a house, and you're not sure if you want to live in California or New York City, just to take an example. So we have two possible goods or ends, living in California or living in New York, but you cannot do both. You have to choose. Now, let's say that you value California more than New York City, so you choose to live in California. You could say that now you are letting go of New York City. It is a second good that you are choosing away because you want this first good, California. But I wouldn't say that New York City becomes a means to living in California. Or if it is a means, perhaps you could say it in the sense that because you're no longer going to live in California, now you don't have to spend time and money on living there. Now that time and money can go to live in California instead. So it becomes perhaps a means in the sense that by not choosing New York, now you have the means at your disposal to be able to live in California. Do you see my point?
Yes, I think I see your point. So as far as I understand, you are saying that if you, for example, have two options that you would both enjoy, and you choose one and thereby choose not to pursue the other, then you couldn't necessarily say that this other option was now a means to pursuing the first option.
Right.
Because I'm just not pursuing a wish or a preference that I have, but this wish or preference thereby doesn't become a means towards pursuing the other option, which I would agree. You are right in this point. But let me try to reformulate what I was saying. So we said that all human action involves ends and means, and you always use the means towards there are always some things that you use in order to achieve the end which you have in mind, which is kind of the reason why you even act at all, because if you wouldn't have any means, any ends in mind, then you wouldn't act. So perhaps we have to define ends a little bit more and means a little bit more precisely. Then could it be that, for example, the end to live in California, that would in some sense be a physical state of reality, namely me living in or having a house or a flat or an apartment in which I can spend my time and which nobody else can take away from me, and this flat has to be in California. So it has to be some kind of material state of reality in the end, this end that I am striving towards. And also the means which I can use have to be material things in reality, like, for example, I own some money, or perhaps I own a car and I can use this to drive to California, or perhaps there is I need a job so that I can get some money so that I can buy a house, etc. So in this example, it seems again that ends and means always have something to do with material reality. Would you agree with that?
I would say that it is often associated with material realities, but it's not absolutely necessary to be so. I would argue that you can imagine that, or conceive of the idea of having ends and using means to get to that end, and the means are immaterial and the end is immaterial. Now, whether there are immaterial things in reality or not, that is a separate metaphysical discussion. But I would say that the matter or materiality of many of the actions we do in everyday life is not, strictly speaking, absolutely necessary to the concept of acquiring an end. So there is a distinction there, I would say.
Do you have a specific example in mind of something being an immaterial means or end?
Well, I would say that whenever you are, you could say, thinking through a rational argument, you are doing some rational deliberation about something, you are using your capacity for reason, your mind, to deliberate. And I would say that the mind is immaterial. And now, of course, people who are materialists would disagree. They would say perhaps that the mind is not material, or that is not immaterial. But actually, that's a very controversial philosophical position to take, and many would disagree with that. So I would say that that is an example of an immaterial operation, to take one example.
Okay. but still the end in mind would be to reach a certain state of your mind, a certain state of mind, which is, for example, that you understand whether an argument is correct or false. And the means that you would employ to reach this end is kind of the process of thinking, or just the specific thoughts themselves would be the means to that end. So still, though it is not material, perhaps we would say there is some state that you would want to reach, which is outside of your volitional control. So you can't just will it to be so. There is kind of some aspect of reality when we leave aside the question if it's material or immaterial, but there is some state of reality that you wish to attain, and there is a certain process that you have to follow to attain it. You can't just will it to be so.
Right, that sometimes you realize that there are certain steps that are necessary to take in order to reach that end. And I would actually say that the end to which you are aiming is not a condition about yourself, that you are in a condition, but rather the object of that condition. For instance, when you are attempting to acquire knowledge about the world around you, like some natural scientist, for instance, when you are doing this process of acquiring knowledge, when you're doing this act, the end in mind is truth or knowledge, and not, philosophically strictly speaking, the state in which you are more informed about reality, but rather the truth or the information or the knowledge itself, the object of that state, you might perhaps say in a philosophical sense. Similarly, another example, pleasure. Many people do things in order to acquire pleasure. So the end in that case would not be the state of having pleasure, but rather the pleasure itself. So do you see sort of my point there?
I would kind of disagree at the moment, because the question is, where does the truth itself or the pleasure itself exist? So if a natural scientist tries to understand the world or a certain aspect of the world, then it seems to me that his goal is to reach this state in which he understands this aspect of the world. So the goal or the end which he pursues is the state of reality in which his mind, whether material or immaterial, contains a certain set of truth, so a certain knowledge about some things which are also in reality. So it is actually a state of reality that is the goal, because if this were not the case, then the question would be, where would this truth, which is the end that he is pursuing, where would it be, if not in reality?
Well, I would say that the truth or other ends that they have in mind in all action, it would be in their mind as a mental concept, the concept of pleasure, the concept of truth or knowledge. So it exists as a mental concept, and their intention, you could say, is to actually have this truth or knowledge. So you could say that the end in mind involves the appropriation of truth or knowledge or pleasure. So there is an aspect in which you have a relation to that which you are seeking. But I would still say that that which you are seeking is this thing which you want to come in contact with. And that is why it makes sense for people to say that I love science so much, because I want to know the truth. What he wants to know is the truth, not to know that he has the truth. There would be sort of a distinction there. So I would say the most relevant feature or thing to consider is that good or perceived good which you are aspiring toward. But perhaps even if you're right that it is rather the state or condition which is the end, perhaps the related points to this when we talk about accelerationism and other things, perhaps those are still applied whether we follow my conception or your conception of what an end is.
Yes, I was also wondering if this is perhaps not very important if we are losing ourselves in a detail here, but still I think that just in my mind, for example, also if you say it's in the end it's a metaphysical question which perhaps we have to discuss another time. But if you say, for example, someone acts and he pursues pleasure, so the goal of his action is pleasure, but then pleasure doesn't exist in and of itself. Pleasure can only exist in the form or that an individual experiences pleasure. That's what it means for pleasure to exist. And therefore, the goal would actually be to reach this state of reality in which I, as an individual, experience pleasure. And the fact when we say I am pursuing pleasure, then this is actually a shorthand, a linguistic shorthand for this more cumbersome formulation that I am trying to reach this state of reality in which I experience pleasure.
That's an interesting point, and I would agree that pleasure in itself implies that there is someone experiencing that pleasure. So there is a very important element of the experience, the subjective experience of pleasure. And I would also agree or extend that to other ends like knowledge. The concept of knowledge involves that there is someone who knows this knowledge. So yes, perhaps this is consistent with what I said earlier, that the end involves some subject or agent appropriating that perceived good. But yes, you could still sort of say that things like pleasure and knowledge, that yes, it involves you appropriating it, but still there is an element of something out there that you appropriate. So perhaps you could say that it is a perceived good and implicitly you achieving that. So, but as I said, it's a very interesting metaphysical question, and perhaps this can be something we can deliberate more about in various cases. So, but yes, I think it's very interesting to discuss this. That is something I would agree with. That it's something to ponder upon, you could say. So yes. Yeah. By the way, there was one thing I had in mind as well. There are some cases where you want to reach an end, and the end does not concern yourself or your state. Let's say you have a person who is sacrificing his own life in an heroic action of saving someone else's life out of self-sacrificial love. Then the end in his mind would not be some state in which he's reaching, because he will just be, his body would be literally destroyed in that act which he's doing. His end is someone else's welfare or life, you could say. So that would be an example. That would be an example of an end which is not related to your welfare, you could say. Now, whether you could say that, well, It's possible that you might continue to live on as an immortal soul, but perhaps some people do not believe in an immortal soul and think that when I do this act of self-sacrifice, I will cease to exist completely. I wouldn't live as a soul or anything. In that case, he would have an end which doesn't concern him at all in any way in his mind. Now, whether he would actually go on to live in a soul or not, that is a separate metaphysical question. But in his mind, his end does not concern him at all. So that's an interesting example of that.
Yes, I think this is a good second point that you brought up here, that the end doesn't necessarily have to concern oneself in any way, either materially or immaterially. So then, yes, you could, for example, have the end that some other person can experience pleasure, or that some other person might know or learn something, which, as we have discussed, are not at least clearly material states of reality, but still it would be, in my understanding, a state of reality that you try to bring about, even though it doesn't necessarily concern your own existence, because you might sacrifice yourself in the process. And I think also for this discussion, it is useful to use the shorthand of saying that the end which you are pursuing is pleasure or knowledge, and the metaphysical question might be a question for a separate discussion.
Right. It's yes, it's something one can discuss more details about, that what is the relation between the thing you are wanting to have and you having it, for instance. That's a very interesting philosophical discussion. But anyways, we see that all action involves ends and means. We have an end in mind and we use means to acquire it. Whether we actually achieve that end or not, that is a separate question. Our action could be failure or it could be success, depending upon whether the means we use are appropriate in order to reach that end. And you could say that there are certain ends which you should have, and there are ends which you should not have. Ends which are, you could say, misguided, or ends that are consistent with the welfare of your being. So for instance, if you are sick and you have the end in mind of becoming healthy, that's a good end, because that is good for your being or body to be healthy. And if you have an end in mind to do something which is unhealthy, like drink a lot of alcohol and intoxicate your brain, that is a bad end. That is an end which contradicts that which is good for your body. And you can say, on a deep metaphysical level, all human beings desire their own good. I think Aristotle argued something like that, that all beings desire happiness, or all human beings desire happiness. And we, in a deep level, desire that which is actually objectively good, but whenever we try to acquire that good in things which do not give us what we deeply want, then we are acting irrationally. We're employing means that doesn't actually suit us, that doesn't actually get us what we truly want. And that touches upon what we have been talking about earlier, that people desire to live a great virtuous life, but instead they choose convenience, but it doesn't really end their thirst for greatness or happiness or virtue or love. And also we talked about the concept of sin, that the word sin has been associated or is based upon the idea of missing the goal. So that is also very relevant to this idea. So those are also very important and valuable insights related to ends and means, this idea.
Yes, these are good considerations that you bring up here. So now we are moving to this question whether the ends justify the means. And I think, yes, how should I say? So I see your point that many or all every time a human being acts in a certain way, he does so because he thinks that what he is doing leads to some good. And the good, it can be kind of very twisted. The good can even be the extinction of all humans, if you think that it's bad that any human beings exist. And then when you act in order to bring about the extinction of human beings, then you will feel that this is a good action, even though it is kind of contradictory, as we have also discussed in a couple of previous videos. So, so what we see is that people always act based on having some end in mind, and this end that they have in mind always seems to be desirable or good to them, but sometimes they can be, perhaps they can be misled, or they can make a mistake in their judgment about whether this end actually, whether this, they might think something is good, but it's actually not leading to something which is good. And the question, of course, now arises, how or based on what standard can we make this judgment? So yeah, based on what standard can we make this judgment? And I think that would be an interesting question.
So the question is, on what basis can we make the judgment that someone is acting irrationally, in the sense of using the wrong means to reach his desired end?
No, almost. That how can we make this judgment that someone is desiring the wrong end? So for example, when someone drinks too much alcohol, obviously in this moment when he does drink too much alcohol, he thinks, all things considered, that this is actually an action which will lead him towards the end which he desires. But still it is, but still we would say that it's not good for him. So he is actually mistaken in his desire, or in the end to which he is trying to come. Or as you said before, some people have, they choose convenience, and they choose things which they think are convenient and good for them in that sense, but this convenience doesn't satisfy their thirst or their desire, and they are still not happy with life or with existence. And therefore we would say that they are choosing the wrong end. But based on what standard can we make this judgment about whether the end that somebody is pursuing is right or wrong?
Right. So it goes back to what we were discussing earlier about certain things being good or bad, depending on whether it is good or bad for your being, your body, for instance. And it goes back to the idea of human beings having a specific nature or essence, and that which contributes to the well-being of your body, literally, is good, and that which destroys it, like when you injure yourself or drink too much alcohol, then you're doing something which is objectively and then scientifically, I might add, bad for your body. And so we have this standard of well-being, whether something is good for your well-being or bad for your well-being. Now, when it comes to the idea of desired ends, you could say that when we're talking about something that could be called, I suppose, explicit desire, in the idea that in your head you think of something and you think that you desire it. Insofar as you're reaching that desire, that could be, you could say, successful. For instance, let's say you have a person who is, yes, drinking too much alcohol, but in his mind, he wants to drink too much alcohol. That is actually what he desires to do for some reason. And then he actually drinks too much alcohol. then you can say that he has successfully reached that goal. He has accomplished that which he actually explicitly desired or thought he desired. However, there is this implicit desire that is more fundamental to his being, his desire to be happy, to be content, and to be fulfilled in his very being. You could make this metaphysical argument that happiness, true, real happiness, must involve the fulfillment of your nature, the fulfillment of your being. And as long as you are objectively unfulfilled in your being, there will always be something lacking in it. And since we human beings have the capacity to sense our being, we can sense if there is something wrong with us, you could say. We will not feel truly content or truly happy unless our being is actually objectively fulfilled. I think Aristotle would say something like that, and St. Thomas Aquinas and thinkers like that. And then we have the question of, okay, well, what is actually fulfilling for our being? What is actually good? What is it that actually we deeply desire? And then you can go to things like goodness or love, virtue, things like that. And one can discuss deeper why or how those things are objectively good and that which you actually desire. But that is at least some metaphysical considerations that I would point out to this question.
Yes, yes. I think these are some very valuable points that you made here. So we could say that human beings have a certain nature, and therefore some ends which they pursue consciously could be in accordance or not in accordance with their nature, and therefore lead them in the long run towards this feeling or this state of contentment or feeling fulfilled and kind of satisfied, because your own existence is in accordance with your nature, or towards another state where you are not existing in accordance with your nature and therefore feeling that something is wanting or missing and still unhappy, even though perhaps you have achieved that which you have consciously desired, like drinking alcohol or having a lot of money or having a lot of fame or having a lot of, I don't know, sex with different people. But still you might feel this emptiness inside of you, that even though you have achieved these things which you have desired, still you are not feeling content. Whereas somebody who has kind of reached the state of fulfilling his own nature would feel content, even though he might not have a lot of money or a lot of these other things that I have mentioned. So yes, I think that's that seems true. I would mention that it's still difficult in each specific instance to deliberate or to find out whether now something is in accordance with one's nature or not, because reality is very complex. So just the example I was thinking of, there might be that a person wants to, I don't know, socialize or get to know or talk to a certain woman, but he is shy. And then he thinks, if I drink a little bit of alcohol, then this will help me to kind of, it will kind of eliminate the shyness, and then I will be more able to speak to other people or to this woman. Now, I'm not saying this is the optimal course to take, but it might also sometimes actually lead to a good outcome, because there are people who drink and then they get to know someone and then they marry this person after a couple of years and then it actually leads to something good. So that's not me saying you should go and drink alcohol, but just I think the actual deliberation whether something is now in accordance with nature or not might be difficult in the specific instances. But in general, I think the argument is true that you have advanced.
Interesting. It seems that the example you brought forward and the principle that was related to that is very related to this topic we're originally discussing. Does the ends justify the means? And can you have means that might be bad in some immediate short-term sense, but good in a long-term sense? And that is very relevant to that question of ends justifying means. For as your example points out, here we have a person who might drink a lot of alcohol and perhaps even intoxicate himself to a certain degree, which is actually bad for his brain or mind. But it has a good side effect, which is that he boosts his confidence. And now he's more able to do things like talk to a woman he likes, and that will result to him having a happy marriage, which will then be good for him because now we have found someone he can share his life with and share mutual love, etc. That's a very good question of, okay, what would we say about this situation and similar situations? And I would argue, or at least I suppose many things could be said about it, but some thoughts that I just had about it is that this particular instance of using this means to achieve this end, it seems to me that you could argue that actually even then it wouldn't work to achieve your end, that actually it wouldn't achieve success, because you could say that if you have this confidence based on you having alcohol in yourself, then that is not really a sustainable and a healthy way to build a good relationship, because if your confidence is contingent upon you having alcohol in your system, then you're not really confident by your own power. You could say you're not acquiring a virtue and becoming truly confident. It becomes simply a side effect of some alcohol that you're having within yourself. But when you think about it, if you really want to have a good foundation for a relationship, you should rather acquire the virtue of confidence, or whatever you call it, confidence, independently of alcohol. So that becomes a, you could say, a more sustainable and healthy and true confidence. And it wouldn't actually work to have this fake confidence, you could say, from this alcohol. It becomes sort of a game that you use alcohol to boost a sort of fake confidence instead of actually having a true confidence. So therefore, it wouldn't work. So yes, that is at least one thought I had about it. So yes, you could share your thoughts about it if you want.
Yes, it's a good thought that you had here, and I think it's also true. And it's funny how we kind of all of a sudden now we are in the middle of this discussion, which was actually the topic we wanted to discuss. Do the ends justify the means? And I think also what you mentioned is that there might be some things might be bad in the short term, but good in the long term, or vice versa. And I think this the question of time makes this this question that we are discussing much more complex, and also much more much more complex, because if you have, for example, if you didn't have this consideration of time, then you could just think, okay, what is the benefit of something and what is the downside of something? And if the benefit is better than the downside, then I will choose to do it. And if not, then I will not do it. So if you had like, if you didn't have this component of time, I think it would be much easier. But as you said, for example, if you use alcohol to boost your confidence, then this might this might lead to your desired outcome in the short term, but it might not be sustainable in the long term. And so I think, at least in part, what people mean when they say that the ends do not justify the means is you shouldn't sacrifice long-term goals for short-term goals. And in this specific example that I have brought up, the long-term goal would actually be to have a good life in the long term, and that would, as a part, require that you have confidence which is based in yourself and not a byproduct of a substance which most of the time you will not have in your system. And therefore, it would be better to overcome your fear without help of alcohol, so that you will acquire this true confidence, so that in the long run you will then be happy, even though it will mean that you will have to sacrifice your short-term goal, because you might not be able to talk very self-confidently to this woman in this moment. So I think, yeah, the question of short-term and long-term has a lot to do with the question that we are discussing here.
Yes, that's an interesting point. And I would sort of say that when we have short-term and we have long-term, you could say that what a person truly deeply desires is that which we generally might put in a category of long-term, even though technically speaking, I could imagine that you can have a good desired end even irrespective of time. But even if we leave that question aside, I would say that in this, say in the situation, the example you brought forward, that what that person truly desires is to have a deep, meaningful, and healthy relationship with that woman. And that cannot be acquired unless he actually acquires these virtues like confidence, because it will actually not help his case, this what he truly deeply desires, to sort of twist his mind with alcohol to make himself be be confident in a fake way. So you could say that, well, perhaps he is desiring just to talk to this woman, and that's all he desires. Well, why does he desire to talk to that woman? Ultimately, it's to have this long, meaningful, and valuable relationship, and not simply to talk with her. So there you could say that this long-term end is actually what he really desires. And perhaps you could formulate it this way, that what he desires long-term is actually what he desires short-term. So because what he really desires, you could say that, okay, so he desires a truly deeply meaningful and healthy relationship with that woman. And to have that, he could have that tomorrow or the next few seconds. But it's long-term because we consider it to be something that lasts for a long time. So you can say that he actually desires the long-term. In the short-term, in that which he truly and deeply desires. But then he chooses irrational means, or he acts irrationally by using means that doesn't actually get what he truly wants. So yes, that's some thoughts that I had right now. So
interesting thoughts that you brought up there. I had a couple of thoughts myself while you were speaking. So I think what I understand, kind of what you are saying, is that somehow the goal, kind of the highest goal in the hierarchy in the end, is to have a good life. And therefore, and the other things are kind of, why would you want to talk to this woman? well, the talking in itself cannot really be the end, but the talking is just the end, like in the first step, because then I think through the talking I might get to have a good and beautiful and meaningful relationship with this woman. So, and why would I desire that? Because that's kind of a part of what is a good life for a human being. Like the desire to have a relationship kind of comes out of the human nature. So I think that's an interesting point. I would want to pose a question to you though, because I do think that we can, or human beings oftentimes have different desires which at least superficially seem to also sometimes contradict each other. And so, and yeah, so, and perhaps something could be like, I wish to, whatever, I'm trying to think of something, but yeah, let's stay with this example. Some person who is listening to this conversation will probably say, well, yeah, but sometimes I just see a woman and I just want to have sex with her, and I'm not actually caring about having a long, deep and meaningful relationship. And so this desire might even go contrary to my other desire, which is to at some point have a long, meaningful relationship with some woman. And so I think human beings can have different desires that contradict each other and maybe have a different time frame, because I can also desire things which even go over the end of my own life. So for example, I would desire that my children live in a good and stable society, but at the same time, I might desire to just, yeah, have sex with some people and not really care about the consequences. So what do you think of that?
So yeah, there are multiple things that you said there, interesting points. And to the last thing you said, it is true that you can have certain desires which actually contradict other desires. And here I would say that you have this distinction between these explicit desires, or what you think you desire, you might even say, and your deep desires that you truly want. So you might think that you desire, say, some manifestation of pleasure, like in the example you brought forward. But it doesn't actually, as Zoe pointed out, it doesn't end your thirst for happiness and contentment. Or you could say love for another person of the opposite sex, and having a truly meaningful, healthy relationship. That you are trying to satisfy that thirst by means of lust, you could say, and that doesn't actually get you what you truly want. So whenever we have people who are acting in ways that does not fulfill the nature, or contradict the nature and contradict their being, they are literally acting irrationally, because they have this deep end in mind, and they're trying to achieve that end in the wrong place. So they are using the wrong means to acquire that ultimate end. And here also here is relevant to talk about the idea of intermediary ends and ultimate ends. That there are, as you sort of pointed out, certain ends which we want to achieve because they lead to higher ends, like this hierarchy you talked about earlier, that we value some ends by virtue of them being necessary to reach some higher end. And these intermediary ends can either be good intermediary ends by virtue of actually bringing you toward that ultimate end, or bad intermediary ends that you view them as getting you what you truly want, this ultimate end, but actually getting you on the wrong path altogether. And when you are doing that, you're acting literally irrationally because you're using wrong means to reach what you truly want.
Yes, I think that's very well how you put it. So, so the idea would be that what people truly desire is happiness, or this state of contentment with existence, if you so want. And this would kind of be the ultimate end. And then people might be mistaken about the means or intermediary ends that they want to employ, because they think it will actually lead them to this ultimate end. Because, and I think from my own experience that this is true, because sometimes I also feel like this explicit desire, as you called it, for certain things, but then I think, no, if I pursue this path, then it will actually not lead to something good in the long run, and therefore it cannot be the correct path toward the ultimate end, which is this state of happiness and contentment. And so in that sense, and some people might not in a certain moment be aware that the way they are trying to satisfy the ultimate end, like this intermediary end, is actually leading them in a bad direction. And therefore, judging from the outside, you would say they act irrationally, because if they knew that this was actually leading them in the wrong direction, then they wouldn't act in this way.
Right, right. And I was actually thinking about this specific point yesterday or the day before that. And in light of these facts, this old expression, ignorance is the root of all evil, creates a very interesting meaning, because you could say that literally that is true, because whenever you do something that is immoral, which, as we have been discussing, is something that contradicts goods for human nature, you are thinking of reaching an end which is good for you, but you are ignorant of the right means to acquire it. So you use wrong means because you mistakenly believe that that will get you what you want. So actually, you could say that all bad action, all immoral action involves ignorance. So that's a very interesting take on the expression. I have heard the expression being associated or attributed to Plato, and I wasn't quite sure exactly what he had in mind when he said it, but perhaps it was precisely this point he had in mind, by which he said ignorance is the root of all evil. I don't know if he actually said ignorance is the root of all evil, or whether it's just a quote attributed to him, but at least it's a very interesting point, this thing we were discussing. So this also touches upon the relationship between ethics and happiness, if I can also briefly mention that, because there appears to, even today, to be people who think that to be moral and to be happy are two different things. And sometimes to do the right thing means that you have to sacrifice your own happiness. And I suspect this has something to do with the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who seemed to argue that you should simply do that which is moral out of duty, and not because you want it or because you want to have joy in it or happiness. You should simply do it because it's your duty. So he seemed to have made this separation between happiness and ethics. And some people do that today, it seems. But now we're arguing that no, actually, the ethical life is the life of happiness. And that's a very good point, because then you can argue to people, when people ask, well, why should I live an ethical life? Because it will make you happy. It will get you what you truly desire. And that's a very beautiful thing to think about.
Okay. Yes. I think you made a good case here, and it's kind of you brought the argument to this conclusion in a nice way. And if I remember correctly from some lecture, it is somewhere, it was called intellectualism, this idea that all evil is basically just an intellectual error or a missing of knowledge. And it was attributed to Socrates or Plato, I think. So somewhere in this area of Greek philosophy, I think this idea is present. And it is interesting to think about, because on the surface, it looks a little bit silly, this idea to say, yes, all evil people are just not knowledgeable enough, because some people, they perform evil acts fully knowing the consequence of their action, and still they perform them. So you can ask, well, how do you mean they are lacking the knowledge? They know exactly what the consequence of their action will be. But if you look at it more deeply, that you say fundamentally, or as the ultimate end, people desire happiness or contentment, and this can only come from an existence which is in accordance with their nature. Then if they choose to act in ways that are not in accordance with their nature, then they will actually never reach their end, even though they might reach their intermediate or conscious ends. They will not reach the actual end, which kind of drives human action in general. So it's an interesting point, and I think too, because some people might say, if you say, yes, you should act morally because that will make you happy, they will say, yeah, well, I don't believe you. I want to have sex with a lot of people, or drink a lot of alcohol, or take some drugs, or be rich or powerful. And I don't believe you that acting morally will make me happy. And then you could perhaps answer, okay, then look at the lives of people who have walked this path that you have now described before you, and see if at some point on this path they actually reached a state where they were content and happy. And I think you will see, if you read these biographies or these historical accounts, that the people who followed this path, they never actually reached happiness or contentment.
Yes, very good points there. You might have people who are, say, wicked dictators, who are very intelligent. They have a lot of knowledge about their own society and their own life, and they are very aware of everything that's happening, but they're actually ignorant, because they have this deep desire for happiness and contentment, and they think they can fulfill it by power or revenge or fame or something like that. But it cannot be achieved in it, because you don't find this goodness that your being desires in those things like power or fame. So therefore we can truly say that evil people are irrational and ignorant in this sense. So this therefore makes the study of ethics, and perhaps you could call this the study of virtue and study of vice, a very valuable and interesting study, because that study would involve, well, what is good for your being? What will actually make you happy? And what kind of vices are there? And why are there these specific vices actual vices? Because this study is studying the ingredients of a good and happy life. And they study that which will deviate from the path to the good and happy life. So here also we see a great value, a great asset that philosophy and particularly ethics have on everyone and everyone's life. It's actually very fundamental, because it concerns a question which we can never escape, which is, how should I live? That question will always be relevant for us. It will always follow us. And to answer that question well will always be relevant. And thus we see that we should live a happy life, and that is the moral life, and everyone, that is true and relevant for everyone on earth.
That's an interesting conclusion, yes, and I think a good argument. I have later an interesting point we could go into if you want to on this point, but I think judging from what we have said so far, we would then conclude that that the ends do not justify the means, because the ends kind of, the ultimate end is happiness or contentment, and to achieve that you need to have a good life and you need to live virtuously, and therefore if you use immoral means, then you are destroying kind of that thing which is the most important for achieving your happiness. Because if you use immoral means, then you are not living virtuously or morally, and therefore you will not achieve this contentment with yourself or with your life in general, and therefore you cannot reach happiness. You can only reach certain intermediate ends like power or pleasure or money or fame or things like that, but you cannot reach the actual ends by false means.
Right, exactly. You can formulate it in a more general philosophical statement that good ends will only have good means, and if you have bad means, that means that you shouldn't reach that end, because then if you have a bad means, then you have an intermediary end which deviates from the path to the good and happy life.
So you could say intermediary ends could justify bad means, but the ultimate end, the ultimate good end, can only be reached via good means.
Well, almost. I wouldn't say that bad means can justify bad ends, but you could say that the bad ends are not justified. So even if the means succeed in reaching the bad end, those bad ends are not justified, because first of all, it doesn't get you what you truly want, and second of all, it's also because it contradicts your being, and it's as we've been discussing before, that it's as such immoral to act contrary to your being. That's a metaphysical principle, that it is impossible for it to be morally good for you to attack your being or attack your nature, you could say. So that also is another aspect of why ends do not justify means, because evil things that are intrinsically evil, are evil so that it can never be justified to use them, because it doesn't lead to happiness, and because it contradicts your nature. And those two things are aspects of the same reality, you could say.
Yes, so I think if I understand you correctly, then you could say whenever you are thinking that some end might justify some bad means, then actually this means that the end which you have in mind is not a true or good end, that there is some error.
You could say that. You could say that.
So that could be a practical conclusion from this long discussion.
Right. Yes, you could. That is true. You could say that, and perhaps some would object that, well, can't you do something which is good for your nature or your being, but bad for others' nature or others' being? Some would perhaps object to that, but I would argue that no, actually, to be a good person, to have a good nature or fulfill a nature, involves also treating others in society well. And that is perhaps something we can discuss more in a separate conversation one day, but that's also something I could point out. But yes.
Yes, I will take note of that, because I think that would be a good separate discussion. So can something be good according to my nature, but still bad for some other human being, let's say? Or if we want to go into the vegan debate, which we soon will have, then also bad for an animal. So that's an interesting question right there, perhaps for a separate conversation. I also had a question that went through my mind, which is something, that bothers me a little bit, because if you look at the theory of evolution, which I believe to be a very, at least very strong and convincing theory, then you could say evolution doesn't care if human beings or any living being is happy or not. So the goal of evolution is not happiness, but material success, in the sense of propagating your genes and making as many copies of them as possible. And so you could say, well, because we have kind of said that the goal of people, the highest goal is happiness or contentment, and therefore they might be in error if they, for example, pursue power. But if you take the evolutionary view of this question, then you could say, no, the end goal is to have as many offspring as possible over a long time frame. So that makes it more complicated, because even, for example, if you are a dictator and you have a lot of children, if the society collapses and all your children die, then still it wasn't very successful. But still, if you are just content, but you don't actually have any children, and you die, and some other society, for example, moves in and replaces you, then how is that successful in the long run? So what do you think of this question?
Well, first of all, concerning evolution, that is a topic on which we would differ. So perhaps that could be an idea for a future discussion or debate about evolution or differing opinions. So that's an idea for an occasion in the future. So I would say that this goes into the question of teleology, ends as objective ends that things have in that is related to their nature. And what is relevant for the moral life is the ends of your human nature or your being, and not this general process that some would call evolution. So whether one thinks that evolution is true or false, if you just compare the concept of evolution and human nature and human end, what would be relevant for morality is that which is good for your being, good for your nature, and not this process of species development, or whatever you would describe evolution as. This is perhaps also something we could get more into in a separate discussion, but that's a very brief thought that I could share.
Yes, that's that's an interesting thought indeed that you brought up here. I remember in a discussion, a friend of mine also said this once. He said, I don't really care about evolution. I care about my own life and my own experience. Or so concerning me as an active agent in the world, I am not in that sense a slave to evolution. I am I have this nature that I have, and this is what affects me, and not, as you said, some big or long-term or material process of which I am in some sense a part. So I think that's an interesting point, and I think also this would go into a big question, which is not, which would be its own discussion, the difference between knowing how to act in the world and knowing how material objects interact. So the difference between science in the sense of describing material reality and ethical or religious or philosophical teachings that want to tell you how you should act. Because as soon as the question is concerned, how should I act, then it kind of has to do with like me as the subject am in the center of this question. Whereas when you want to describe material reality objectively, then the subject is not in the center, but is kind of eliminated almost from the view. And so, for example, Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris had a long discussion about exactly this problem. So yeah, I think we are running into this question here.
Yes, that seems to be about the distinction between what you can call moral science and natural science. And because the ends of each are different. The end of moral science is the good life. How do you live a good life? And natural science is to understand the physical, natural world around you. So natural science, you would acquire knowledge about the natural world for the sake of knowing how the natural world works. That is the end. You're doing it for the sake of acquiring that knowledge. In moral science, it is for knowing the good life. So yes, those would be two distinct disciplines or sciences, you would say, or you could say. Now, of course, sometimes some findings of natural science could be relevant to certain things in social life, for instance, like technology, or how you are going to relate to dangerous animals. If you're living close to dangerous animals, like in Australia, that could certainly be useful to know something about them. But they are two distinct disciplines with two distinct ends.
Yes, interesting. And so you could say, even if certain, for example, a tyrant that reaches a lot of power, even, or perhaps that's not really a good example, but perhaps just someone who cheats and thereby gets a little bit more money, even if this person is evolutionarily more successful, then what does this concern me? Because I am trying to reach a good life and not to be per se evolutionarily successful. Though somewhere I have this intuition, and I think this would be one of my big goals to prove this biological argument, that actually in the long term, these things which we call moral are exactly moral because they are evolutionarily successful. So this again goes to this question of the time frame, because if I just look at the time span of my own life, then it's certainly true, if I acquire a lot of power, then perhaps I will have a lot of children. And if some beggar on the street doesn't have any power, then he won't have any children. And so I will be, evolutionarily speaking, more successful than he. But there is this idea, and Jordan Peterson always says that this is kind of his own experience of his clinical practice, and also the way he understands the religious texts that, like the Bible, that actually you don't get away with anything in the long run. So, for example, there is this idea in the Old Testament that God says, I pursue the sins of the fathers on the third and fourth generation. And how you could understand this is, yes, of course, I can now cheat in business and perhaps gain an advantage. But if I do this, then it will lead to more people cheating, and slowly the society will start to fall apart. And after a couple of generations, everything goes to hell. And then it will actually not be morally advantageous. So no, evolutionarily advantageous. So perhaps if you take a long enough view, then the moral and the evolutionary successful meet, and they are the same thing. So that would be something that I would like to be able to prove argumentatively.
Interesting. That's an interesting thought. To that idea, I would say that here we would then have a case of evolutionary success and success in your life to overlap, so that they have a similarity in those things. So they would still be two distinct things. That what is relevant for morality is success as regards fulfillment of your being. And sometimes, according to those principles you were describing, evolutionary process could overlap that. Now, again, whether the theory of evolution is true or false, that is a separate discussion. But just considering the ideas or concepts, we see this. You can see overlap, but still distinct things.
Yes, and I think that's true, because from the point of view of the individual, the question of how to lead a good life can or cannot be connected to any things that come out of the theory of evolution. So yeah, and as you said, the objective of the material of the natural science and of the moral science are two different objectives, though perhaps how they are interlinked is also something that would have to be discussed further.
How they're interlinked, you said?
Yes, because you could, for example, this was the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris discussion. You could ask the question, well, is moral science kind of subordinate to material science, or is the material science subordinate to moral science? So is the fact that some people are natural scientists and try to understand the world, is that in some aspect a part of how to lead a good life? Or is the question of how to lead a good life a part of the question to how to understand material reality?
That's an interesting question. I would say that the moral science is higher than natural science in two senses. The first sense is that it's higher because it has more importance to our life, and our life is always in the focus of us human beings. That will always be relevant for us. So whenever we have ourselves in mind, moral science is more relevant than natural science, because you said that how you are going to live a good life is a question that is more intimate to you than a question of how the nature around you works, even though the natural world or biological world is also interesting and could be relevant in some accidental way. Perhaps you could say that, but moral science is more intimately connected to your life, and you will always have your life at the center of your life. Yeah, literally. And also the other sense would be in the, you could say, metaphysical sense, in the order of things' importance in the objective reality. Because I would say that the higher aspects of the human being, what could be called the soul or the intellectual powers of the soul, our mind, our free will, and our virtues, are objectively a more valuable and nobler aspect of reality than mere material, natural operations in nature. So there is this hierarchy, metaphysical hierarchy, of the metaphysical value of things according to how great these things are. So because the intellectual powers are higher than the bodily things or the material things. Now that would be a separate discussion in itself, but that would be my answer. That it's that moral science is higher than natural science in these two senses.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting question, and as you said, also this question of kind of the metaphysical rank of something would be a question for a whole separate discussion. Perhaps it's also, yeah, it's kind of a question perhaps also of value judgment. But I think the other point that you made, that kind of my life, or yeah, my act of living is always at the center of my life, is, it seems tautological, but it just shows that it's true. And therefore, I think you can make a strong case that moral science is actually more important for a human being himself than natural science. Even though you could say that natural science is also important for different aspects of life. And it's interesting because I talked also with a friend once that whenever you solve a material problem, soon you run into a new problem. So for example, we have had a lot of material success through our science and technology in the last couple of 100 years. But still, we are not running out of material problems. So for example, you have a cell phone, so now you can communicate very quickly with people who are far away, which used to be a big problem in the past. But now you just have a new problem, which is that, for example, you are now expected to call or call back or text back a lot of people all the time, and it starts to even become a burden sometimes on your time and on your ability to do something else. Or yes, and the more time you spend on your cell phone, the less time you actually do something useful in reality. So, and many similar points could be made for medicine or for other things. And so it seems that even though we make great progress with natural science, we are not fundamentally solving the fundamental problem, which, as we have talked about, is that we desire happiness or contentment, but we have this thirst and we are trying to quench it maybe by the wrong means.
Right, yes. So today, when we have a lot of technological process, or we have had a lot of technological progress, we have a lot of technology that we didn't have before, still there are so many out there who struggle with unhappiness and feeling miserable or depressed or having some deep problem with their lives. So we see that the moral science is still a very relevant and important subject, as it must be. And even if certain material technological advances have been taking place, still moral science is no less relevant. And even if you have a high degree of success in natural science, if you have a low degree of success in moral science, that is what we have to focus on. And that's a very important point. Also, a slightly separate point, I would say, about knowledge or knowing truth and the idea of morality or finding the good. I could point out in the classical theistic tradition, and especially in Catholicism, those two things would, on the most deep, ultimate metaphysical level, be the same, because it would be said that the ultimate truth to be reached is God, and the ultimate goodness to have is also God. God is both the supreme truth and the supreme essential good. And the idea of heaven, to be in heaven, would be both to be presented with unlimited goodness and unlimited truth. So there, actually finding truth and finding goodness would be the one and the same thing. Now, of course, to discuss whether this is true or not, that's a separate discussion, but I just wanted to point it out as an interesting metaphysical principle in Christianity, and it seems to be a general classical theistic point as well.
Yes, that's, as you said, would be an interesting separate discussion. I do think we have reached a good conclusion for this topic, or for this discussion, that moral science is very important, and its importance is in no way made smaller by certain advantages of natural science. And I feel like we are currently in a time where the natural science has progressed very far, but moral science has not really progressed at all. It seems to be kind of on the same level as, I don't know, it used to be forever, and so I think our society would profit a lot more from investing time and energy into moral development, instead of just running faster and faster on the path of natural science.
Yes, you make a good point there. And as we've been talking about earlier, moral education is the most important education, and that is severely lacking in today's society. The idea of being raised to become a good, virtuous, responsible person, to have virtues like justice, courage, temperance, and patience and prudence, we lack that, and those are seriously needed. A good education in good virtues, those are needed, and we lack that, and that's a huge problem.
Yes, and also I think it's something that each person has to dedicate a lot of time and energy and want to achieve it in order to achieve it. So it's yeah, I think it's very important. It's very important to think about and strive towards becoming a good person. And yes, we are not placing very much focus on it in our society, which is it's a big problem, and a big it's sad. Yeah, it would be much better if we did so.
Right, and what we see today rather is the implementation to some degree of false moral principles, like a critical race theory. The idea that racism is everywhere in the West, and it's institutional, and white people have to apologize to black people for the white privilege and all that. That is radical left-wing idea, but it's being pushed in school to the United States. So it's very sad that instead of having a good philosophical or moral education in virtues, that is presented instead. So that's very sad.
Yes, I agree, and I think all the more important for philosophically minded people to take up this conversation and to debate and argue against people who present false moral principles, and to show how these principles are internally contradictory, or contradictory to some obvious aspect of human nature, or just to disprove them, and to make this discussion more wide in society. Because, as you said, certain moral principles are presented as true, but they are, at least at the moment, oftentimes false, and therefore they should be challenged and disproven.
Right. Bad ideas need to go, and good ideas need to be presented and spread.
Yes. So, and I hope we too are doing our own small part in this as best as we can.
Yes, that's a good point to sort of conclude this conversation as well, that we are hopefully contributing well to the conversation, and hopefully making people in the audience have some new good thoughts to think about and spread good ideas further. So I suppose this is a place to end the conversation, unless there are some points you want to bring up, Amos.
No, yes, I agree. This is a nice and beautiful conclusion for this conversation that we had. So I thank you for it, and I thank the audience for listening, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in another video.
Great. Yes, thank you for being on this and having this conversation. And I also thank the audience, everyone who was watching. And I wish you and the audience a great Friday. And also, it will be interesting to see the next conversation and how that will go.
Yes, great. So see you all later. Goodbye.
Goodbye, and have a good weekend.